My parents handed my sister a $20 million check to build her dream business and told me I was just wasting space in their house. I packed my bags, cut them out of my life, and never looked back. 5 years later, her business collapsed, she lost everything, and she broke down screaming outside my beachfront villa, demanding to know why I get everything. She had no idea I had just bought all their debt. Before I share exactly how I pulled this off, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to walk away from toxic family members who underestimated you. The crystal chandelier cast a warm golden glow over the massive mahogany dining table in my parents' Buckhead estate. I am Amara, 30 years old, and I was sitting at the far edge of the table nursing a glass of sparkling water. The air was thick with the smell of expensive catering, and my mother Valerie's signature designer perfume. We were an affluent African-American family, a fact my parents never let anyone forget. They cared about country club memberships, elite social circles, and maintaining a flawless public image above all else. Across from me sat my younger sister, Kendra, 28 years old, and the undisputed golden child. She was beautiful, spoiled, and completely lacking in any real-world skills. Next to her sat her husband Bradley, a 30-year-old white man from a thoroughly average middle-class background who always seemed a little too eager to spend our family wealth. He wore a smug, self-satisfied smile that I had learned to despise from the moment they started dating. My father Marcus stood at the head of the table. He raised his glass of vintage bourbon, his voice booming with the artificial authority he loved to project during these family gatherings. To Kendra and Bradley, my father announced, his chest puffed out with pride. "May your new luxury organic skincare line take the world by storm. We are so proud of your vision, your entrepreneurial spirit, and your drive to build a real empire." The subtle dig at me was not lost on anyone. I worked in financial technology, writing code and restructuring corporate debt. To my parents, my tech career was invisible and unimpressive because it did not come with glamorous magazine covers or launch parties. I had spent the last 5 years quietly building my financial technology firm from the ground up, securing legitimate investors, and establishing a reputation in the corporate world. Meanwhile, Kendra had bounced from one expensive hobby to another. Now she wanted to sell overpriced lotion, and my parents were willing to blindly fund it. My father reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a crisp piece of paper. He slid it across the polished wood surface directly into Bradley's waiting hands. Bradley picked up the paper, his eyes widening in exaggerated awe before showing it to Kendra. She let out a high-pitched squeal of delight and threw her arms around his neck, pressing a dramatic kiss to his cheek. It was a cashier's check. I caught a clear glimpse of it as Bradley waved it around like a hard-won trophy. The amount, written in bold black ink, was exactly $20 million. But it was not the massive sum of money that made my stomach drop and my heart rate spike. It was the specific routing number printed clearly at the bottom left corner of the check. I recognized those 9 digits instantly. That routing number belonged to the family joint trust account. It was an irrevocable trust set up years ago by my late grandfather to protect our family wealth and ensure the future of his descendants. By strict legal design, that specific account required 2 signatures for any withdrawal over $50,000. It required my father's signature, and it required mine. I had never signed a single document authorizing this transfer. I had never even been consulted about funding Kendra's vanity project. I placed my water glass down on the table. The soft clink of the crystal against the marble coaster cut through the celebratory chatter like a knife. "Dad," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and level, "which account did that check come from?" My father froze mid-sip of his bourbon. His smile tightened instantly, and he shot a quick, nervous glance at my mother. Valerie immediately stiffened in her chair, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned pale. "Why does that matter, Amara?" My mother snapped, her tone instantly defensive and dripping with venom. "This is your sister's special night. We are celebrating her brilliant future. Do not start with your typical jealousy, just because you cannot find a husband or build a real business." "I am not jealous, Mom," I replied, keeping my eyes locked dead on my father. "I am asking a simple legal question." I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the table. I saw the routing number on that check. That is the joint family trust, the one grandfather established. The room went completely silent. Kendra stopped smiling, looking confused, while Bradley quickly pulled the check against his chest, as if I might reach across the table and snatch it from his hands. "How did you authorize a $20 million withdrawal without my signature?" I asked, my voice dropping an octave. The festive atmosphere vanished entirely, replaced by a suffocating hostile tension. My father slowly lowered his glass of bourbon to the table. His eyes narrowed, stripping away any pretense of paternal warmth. It was in that precise moment I realized they had completely crossed the line. The ultimate betrayal had just been finalized right in front of my own eyes. I knew that our relationship as a family was now permanently destroyed. My mother did not miss a beat. Valerie smoothed her silk dress, her eyes flashing with sudden vicious anger. She looked like a queen annoyed by a peasant. "How dare you speak to your father that way?" My mother snapped, her voice slicing through the dining room. "You come to your sister's celebration, sit at our table, and have the audacity to interrogate us about money. You are just wasting space here, Amara. You have always been wasting space." I did not flinch. "I am asking about a $20 million withdrawal from an account that requires my legal consent, Mom. You did not ask me. You bypassed me." Valerie stood, planting her manicured hands on the table. "We bypassed you because you would never understand." She spat, her voice echoing. "Kendra is building a luxury organic empire. She is creating a brand that will put our family name on the lips of every elite socialite in Atlanta. And what are you doing? You are a nobody pushing cheap computer code. You sit behind a screen all day while your sister actually makes a difference. We had to do this to protect the family's elite status from your mediocrity. If we waited for you to do something worthy of the family legacy, we would wait forever. You have zero ambition, Amara. You have no social grace, no vision, and no understanding of what maintaining our position takes. Giving that money to Kendra was an investment in the only daughter who knows how to elevate this family." I looked at my mother, absorbing her toxicity. I swallowed the instinct to scream, to explain my financial technology firm was valuated at over $50 million, or that my code restructured the corporate debts her wealthy friends were drowning in. Defending myself was pointless. They did not want to understand my success. They only wanted an excuse to justify their theft. I looked directly at Bradley. He clutched the check, his smug smile replaced by a nervous, twitchy energy. "An investment," I repeated smoothly, my tone completely devoid of emotion. "Let us talk about this investment. Kendra, tell me your business plan." Kendra blinked, looking taken aback. "What? Your business plan?" I said, leaning back and crossing my arms. "You received $20 million of family money. Surely you have a comprehensive financial projection. What is your customer acquisition cost? What is your projected burn rate for the first 4 quarters? Who manufactures your organic compounds, and what are their supply chain contingencies?" Kendra opened her mouth, then closed it. A flush of deep red crept up her neck. She looked at Bradley for help. "We are focusing on brand awareness and influencer marketing first," Bradley chimed in, puffing his chest to appear larger. "It is a highly competitive market. You would not understand luxury retail. We have an exclusive launch party planned, and we are securing endorsements from top-tier celebrities." I let out a short, humorless laugh. "So you are throwing a party and paying famous people to hold a bottle of lotion. That is not a business plan, Bradley. That is financial suicide." "You do not know what you are talking about," Kendra yelled, her voice pitching into a defensive shriek. "My products are revolutionary. People love them." "You have 0 proprietary formulas," I countered, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. "I looked up your LLC last month. You are white-labeling generic organic compounds from a mass supplier in Florida and slapping a fancy label on the jar. You have no patents. You have no unique distribution channels. You have nothing justifying a $20 million seed investment." My father slammed his hand on the table, glasses rattling. "That is enough, Amara," Marcus roared. "You will not sit in my house and insult your sister's vision. You are just bitter because she had the courage to dream big while you settled for a boring job." "I am not insulting her vision," I replied, standing up slowly. "I am pointing out you handed $20 million of generational wealth to a startup with 0 viable path to profitability. You threw grandfather's legacy into a bottomless pit, because you care more about country club bragging rights than actual financial literacy. Do not you dare invoke your grandfather, Valerie shrieked, walking around the table toward me. He would be ashamed of how you are acting tonight. You are trying to sabotage your sister because you are a bitter, jealous woman. I am not the one who committed federal wire fraud to fund a vanity project, I stated, staring her down. Do not think I do not know what happened. That money was secured by the trust. To move it, someone forged my signature. Since you are the only one with access to the family lawyer managing that account, Dad, I know exactly who did it. Bradley stepped forward, his face red with anger. He pointed a finger inches from my face. You need to watch your mouth. You are making wild accusations because you cannot handle the fact that this family finally invested in someone with actual talent. You are just a pathetic loser. I did not blink. I looked at Bradley's pointing finger, then deep into his angry eyes. The audacity of this man standing in my family's home, holding my family's money and calling me a loser. The blindness of my parents willing to sacrifice their brilliant daughter to prop up a manipulative husband. I am not making accusations, I said in a freezing whisper. I am stating facts. You took the money that was not yours. You bypassed legal protections because you knew I would never approve such a spectacularly stupid investment. You chose to rob me to fund a fantasy. Valerie rushed to comfort her golden child, wrapping her arms around Kendra and glaring at me with pure hatred. Look what you have done. You ruined your sister's celebration. You are toxic, Amara. You have always been so toxic. Bradley stepped around the table, his chest puffed out with an unearned sense of authority. He positioned himself between me and my parents, acting as a protective shield against the so-called toxic sister. His blue eyes were cold, filled with a condescending arrogance that made my blood boil. It was the arrogance of a man who had married into wealth and somehow convinced himself he had built it from scratch. You really have a lot of nerve coming in here and ruining this night, Bradley said, his voice dripping with mock pity. You are just a bitter, lonely woman typing away in a dark room pretending you understand how the real world operates. Kendra and I are innovators. We are creating a legacy. You are just writing code for middle management. I stared at him, refusing to shrink under his gaze. You do not know the first thing about my code or my career, Bradley. And you certainly do not know anything about building a legacy. You are a parasite feeding off my family's trust fund. Bradley scoffed, shaking his head as if dealing with an unruly child. He marched past the dining room archway and into the grand foyer. The marble floors echoed with his heavy footsteps. I watched him approach the antique mahogany coat rack where the butler had hung my trench coat earlier that evening. Next to it sat my leather handbag. Without a second of hesitation, Bradley snatched my coat off the brass hook. He scooped up my handbag with his other hand. The sheer audacity of his actions sent a shockwave through the room. This man, an outsider who had contributed absolutely nothing to our family's wealth, was laying hands on my personal property inside my parents' house. He strode toward the massive double front doors. He gripped the wrought iron handle, yanked the heavy door open, and stepped out onto the grand portico. The cool night air rushed into the foyer, carrying the scent of magnolia and impending rain. With a violent, dismissive heave, Bradley threw my coat onto the stone steps. He tossed my handbag right after it. The bag hit the ground with a dull thud, its gold hardware scraping against the hard stone. Bradley stepped back inside and stood in the open doorway, blocking the exit like a bouncer. He crossed his arms over his chest and looked at me with an expression of absolute triumph. You need to leave and learn how to be independent, Amara. He declared, his voice loud enough to echo through the entire house. There is no room for freeloaders in this family's future. The silence that followed was deafening. The word freeloader hung in the air, thick and absurd. I was a self-made millionaire, completely financially independent since the day I graduated college. I had never asked my parents for a single dime. Meanwhile, the man standing by the door had just happily accepted a stolen $20 million check to fund a fraudulent lifestyle. But the most agonizing part of this moment was not Bradley's pathetic display of power. It was the fact that he felt emboldened enough to do it in front of my own parents. He felt completely safe disrespecting a black woman in her family's home because my parents had permitted it. They had laid the groundwork for this disrespect by treating me like a second-class citizen for years. I slowly turned away from Bradley and looked at my father. Marcus was the patriarch. He was a man who prided himself on respect boundaries and traditional family values. He had thrown men out of his house for raising their voices. Surely he would draw the line here. Surely seeing his own flesh and blood physically evicted by a smug son-in-law would trigger some dormant instinct to protect his child. "Dad," I said, my voice barely a whisper yet, carrying clearly across the silent dining room. "Are you going to let him do this?" My father stood frozen at the head of the table. His hand was still wrapped around his crystal glass of bourbon. For a long, agonizing second, the room held its breath. I waited for him to slam the glass down. I waited for him to point a finger at Bradley and demand he fetch my belongings. I waited for the father I thought I knew to finally stand up and be a parent. Marcus slowly lifted his gaze. He did not look at Bradley. He did not look at the open front door. He looked directly into my eyes, and his expression was completely blank. There was no anger, no remorse, no conflict. There was only a chilling, absolute void. He raised the crystal glass to his lips. The ice clinked softly against the edges. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his bourbon. He swallowed, lowered the glass, and then he simply looked away. He turned his attention back to Kendra, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder as she continued to fake soft sobs against our mother. The message was unmistakable. He was not just permitting Bradley's actions, he was endorsing them. I was being legally and physically erased from the family, and my father was sealing the eviction with a sip of alcohol. My mother Valerie did not even bother to look in my direction. She stroked Kendra's hair, whispering soothing words about how the bad energy was finally leaving their home. They had formed an impenetrable wall, a united front of toxicity and delusion. I was standing in the very house I had grown up in, yet I had never felt more like a stranger. The realization settled into my bones, freezing my heart and snapping the last remaining thread of loyalty I had toward these people. I took one final look at the room, engraving their faces into my mind. I would never forget this betrayal. They had just freely handed me the perfect excuse to destroy them. I turned my back on the dining room, my spine perfectly straight, and walked into the grand foyer. My heels clicked rhythmically against the marble floor, a steady, unhurried metronome marking the end of my ties to this household. I did not shed a single tear. Crying would imply that I was losing something of value, but looking at the pathetic display behind me, I realized I was only losing dead weight. I reached the open front doors, where the humid Atlanta night air was already seeping inside. Bradley was still hovering nearby, his chest puffed out like a bouncer who had just successfully cleared an unruly patron. I ignored him entirely, treating him like a piece of ugly furniture I had to navigate around. I stepped out onto the stone portico and smoothly bent down. I retrieved my trench coat, shaking a stray dry leaf from the fabric, and picked up my leather handbag. I took my time slipping my arms into my coat, adjusting the lapels, and settling the strap of my bag over my shoulder. Only then did I turn back to face the house. They had gathered in the foyer now. Marcus, Valerie, and Kendra stood behind Bradley, forming a united front of delusion and theft. They looked at me with a mixture of triumph and defensive anger, expecting me to beg, to scream, to create the dramatic scene they desperately needed to validate their actions. I denied them that satisfaction. I looked directly into my father's eyes, then shifted my gaze to my mother, and finally to my sister. My voice was eerily calm, cutting through the heavy southern air with lethal precision. Remember this exact moment. Because when this imaginary empire collapses, do not come looking for the daughter you just threw away. I did not wait for a response. I turned on my heel and walked down the sweeping brick driveway. I heard the heavy double doors slam shut behind me, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet neighborhood. It was the sound of a vault ceiling, locking them inside with their terrible financial decisions. I reached my car, slid into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. The leather interior was silent, insulated from the chaos I had just left behind. I started the engine but did not put the car in drive immediately. Instead, I pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated the dark cabin. I opened my contacts list. I tapped my mother's name, block caller. I scrolled to my father. Block caller, Kendra. Block caller, Bradley, block caller. It took less than 30 seconds to digitally erase my entire biological family from my existence. I deleted our shared photo albums, removed myself from the family group chats, and untagged myself from their social media profiles. I severed every invisible string they could possibly use to pull me back. I was completely free. I put the car in gear and drove out of the Buckhead estate gates. As the sprawling mansions rolled past my windows, I tapped my steering wheel display and dialed a number. The phone rang twice before a sharp, awake voice answered. It was Jonathan, my former university professor and current venture capital mentor, a man who understood the ruthless mechanics of the financial world better than anyone. Amara, he answered, noting the late hour. Tell me you have good news. I have better than good news, I replied, navigating my car onto the highway, heading toward downtown Atlanta. I am ready to fast-track the launch of the new financial technology firm. I want to aggressively pursue the distressed asset acquisition model we discussed last month. Jonathan paused, sensing the shift in my demeanor. You sound different. I am different, I stated coldly. I just watched $20 million get incinerated on a vanity project by people who think business is a country club game. I want to build a machine that buys their failures. I want to own the debt of the incompetent elite. I need the initial funding rounds accelerated by tomorrow morning. Jonathan chuckled, a sound of pure predatory approval. I will have the term sheets on your desk by 8 o'clock. Welcome to the war room, Amara. I hung up the phone and pressed the accelerator, speeding into the city lights. That night was the absolute end of the girl who craved her parents' approval and the birth of the woman who would eventually own their lives. The next 5 years became a blur of relentless, unapologetic ambition. I did not take vacations. I did not attend family holidays. I did not look back. My financial technology firm grew from a modest startup into a ruthless, highly efficient corporate entity specializing in purchasing distressed debt and liquidating toxic assets. We targeted the exact kind of businesses my parents' worshipped companies built on vanity, poor planning, and arrogance. We bought their debts for pennies on the dollar, forced brutal restructurings, and stripped them for parts. My algorithms identified financial weakness with terrifying accuracy, and my legal team executed takeovers with military precision. I amassed a personal fortune that dwarfed my grandfather's original trust fund. I moved into a custom-designed penthouse, wore bespoke suits tailored to Project Absolute Power, and surrounded myself with a private security team that ensured no unwanted ghosts from my past could ever ambush me. I became an apex predator in the financial ecosystem, completely untouchable and utterly detached from the sentimental, emotional weakness that had constantly plagued my former family. During those 60 months of silent, aggressive expansion, I never once checked their social media profiles or inquired about their lives. They were dead to me, merely statistical anomalies waiting for the inevitable economic collapse. I knew exactly how this sad story would end. I knew the fraudulent foundation of their luxurious lifestyle would soon crumble under its own massive weight. I only had to bide my time, build my capital, and prepare the perfect trap. 5 years later, the Grand Buckhead estate was no longer a fortress of elite supremacy. It had transformed into an opulent prison of suffocating debt. The transition was a slow, agonizing bleed of resources, a catastrophic financial hemorrhage masked by designer clothing and forced smiles. Kendra and Bradley had burned through the entire $20 million. The money vanished into a black hole of sheer incompetence, reckless spending, and breathtaking arrogance. Their luxury organic skincare empire, built entirely on cheap white-labeled generic lotions and paid celebrity endorsements, had predictably imploded. Consumers quickly realized the revolutionary formulas were nothing more than repackaged drugstore moisturizers with a $400 price tag. The backlash was swift and merciless. Class action lawsuits from angry customers piled up, followed immediately by aggressive litigation from unpaid suppliers. Kendra's vision culminated in a highly publicized, humiliating Chapter 11 bankruptcy filing. The glamorous launch parties were replaced by dreary court appearances and frozen bank accounts. Bradley's smug confidence had evaporated, replaced by a bitter, resentful panic. Their luxury downtown condo, purchased with the initial rush of stolen trust funds, was repossessed by the bank after months of missed mortgage payments. With their credit scores obliterated and their business assets seized, the golden couple had no choice but to pack their remaining designer luggage and retreat. They crawled back to my parents' mansion, moving into their old childhood bedrooms like defeated refugees. The irony was palpable. The sister who had been handed the world on a silver platter was now sleeping under her parents' roof, completely bankrupt and thoroughly disgraced. The husband who had physically thrown me out of the house was now eating my father's food and hiding from process servers. However, the financial devastation did not stop with Kendra and Bradley. The rot had spread deep into the foundation of my parents' wealth. Marcus and Valerie could not bear the thought of their golden child failing publicly. In their frantic attempts to keep up appearances, they had made the ultimate financial blunder. They had foolishly co-signed Bradley's massive corporate loans. They had leveraged their own pristine credit, tapped into their retirement portfolios, and taken out aggressive secondary mortgages on the Buckhead estate to inject emergency liquidity into a dying business. They poured millions into the sinking ship, convinced that one more marketing push would turn things around. They were wrong. The banks did not care about the family's elite social standing or historical prestige in Atlanta. The banks only cared about the balance sheets, and those sheets were drenched in red ink. Now Marcus and Valerie were drowning right alongside their favorite daughter and her incompetent husband. The atmosphere inside the mansion was toxic heavy, with unspoken blame and mounting terror. The household was in a constant state of chaotic panic. The landline rang incessantly, a relentless reminder of their impending doom. It was never friends calling to invite them to galas anymore. It was aggressive debt collectors, ruthless recovery agencies, and frustrated bank representatives demanding immediate payment. Valerie had unplugged the main phones, but the voicemails piled up, filling the digital inbox with automated threats of legal action and asset seizure. The massive stack of mail on the foyer console table was no longer filled with embossed invitations. It was a terrifying mountain of final notices, overdue bills, and thick legal envelopes stamped with urgent red lettering. Marcus refused to open them, letting the letters gather dust while he drank heavily in his study. The stress fractured the family dynamics, turning them against each other in bitter ways. Screaming matches echoed through the grand hallways on a daily basis. Bradley constantly blamed Kendra for mismanaging the marketing budget, hurling insults at her lack of business acumen. Kendra fired back, accusing Bradley of embezzling funds to sustain his own lavish lifestyle and failing to secure competent legal counsel. Valerie spent her days crying in the master suite, mourning the loss of her flawless reputation, while Marcus paced the floors like a trapped animal, agonizing over how he could possibly fix a deficit of this magnitude. The house was a war zone of shattered egos and desperate blame-shifting. There was no loyalty left, only the desperate scramble of drowning people trying to climb on top of one another. But the most agonizing aspect of their downfall was not the lack of money. It was the terrifying threat of social exile. For my parents, their status within the elite African-American community of Atlanta was more valuable than oxygen. They had spent decades cultivating a flawless image of wealth, sophistication, and unbothered superiority. Now that facade was cracking, and the high society vultures were circling. Their exclusive country club membership dues had bounced twice in the last 3 months. Valerie had been forced to quietly resign from 2 prestigious charity boards because she could no longer afford the donation requirements. They stopped hosting their famous dinner parties, claiming they were simply too busy, but the whispers had already started. In their affluent circles, rumors of financial distress spread faster than wildfire. Friends who used to beg for an invitation suddenly stopped calling. Other elite families began distancing themselves, sensing the taint of bankruptcy. Whenever Marcus and Valerie left the house, they deeply and constantly feared being exposed. They dreaded running into old acquaintances, terrified someone would ask about Kendra's business or bring up the lawsuits. They wore dark designer sunglasses like shields, keeping their heads down. They lived in a constant state of severe anxiety, waiting for the moment when the final foreclosure notice would be taped to their iron gates. They were trapped in a nightmare of their own making, cornered by arrogance and paralyzed by debt. They desperately needed a miracle, a silent benefactor, or a foolish scapegoat to absorb the catastrophic financial damage they had caused. They had absolutely no idea the exact person they were searching for was the very daughter they had thrown away, and she was not coming to save them. Inside the suffocating walls of the Buckhead mansion, desperation breeds unholy alliances. Late one Tuesday evening, Marcus summoned Valerie and Bradley into his private study. The room, once a symbol of immense power, now smelled of impending ruin. Marcus locked the heavy double doors, ensuring complete privacy. He leaned heavily against his polished desk, pushing aside stacks of final foreclosure warnings. Valerie sat rigidly on the edge of a leather sofa, her face drawn, while Bradley hovered nervously. They were three drowning rats trapped in a sinking barrel, completely out of options and liquid cash. Traditional banking institutions had permanently closed their doors, laughing at their pathetic attempts to restructure catastrophic liabilities. They needed a fresh, untainted financial vessel to exploit. They needed someone with zero existing corporate debt, a pristine credit score, and a desperate vulnerability to family approval. Marcus poured a glass of cheap whiskey and looked at his son-in-law. The silence was thick with the unspoken realization that they had exhausted every legitimate avenue of survival. It was time to cross the line from gross negligence into active predatory exploitation and terrible desperation. "We have exactly one remaining asset," Marcus stated, his voice devoid of paternal affection. "Amara." Valerie visibly flinched at the sound of my name, adjusting her robe defensively. She had spent the last 5 years pretending I was dead, erasing my existence from her social narrative. Bradley, however, perked up, a glimmer of predatory hope returning to his eyes. They had not checked on my well-being in half a decade, so their perception of my life was frozen in the past. In their arrogant, flawed reality, I was a struggling software coder, living paycheck to paycheck in a cramped apartment somewhere in the suburbs. They pictured me isolated, miserable, and desperate for any scrap of validation from the elite family that had discarded me. They could not fathom a universe where a black woman operating without their prestigious name and financial backing could achieve anything beyond survival. To them, I was just a blank slate, an unused social security number, waiting to be sacrificed on the altar of their country club lifestyle. Marcus laid out his strategy with cold, calculated precision, treating his daughter like a disposable pawn in a chess game. The mechanics of their parasitic plot were cruel. Bradley explained that his toxic shell companies required an immediate guarantor to restructure the crushing debt. He needed a clean proxy to absorb the liabilities and take the legal fall when the companies dissolved. "Amara's credit profile is unblemished," Bradley pointed out, pacing excitedly. "She has no business debt, no mortgages, and a stable income. If we can get her to co-sign a series of new consolidation loans, we can transfer the burden of the bankruptcy onto her shoulders. We can use her pristine credit history to secure bridge financing, pay off the most aggressive creditors, and save this house from foreclosure." Marcus nodded slowly, fully endorsing the plan to financially execute his own child to save his mansion. They mapped out the legal documents they would need me to blindly sign, weaponizing their knowledge of the banking system to ensnare me in a trap of debt. They intended to chain me to a sinking anvil, letting me drown in financial ruin so they could continue sipping champagne on their veranda. It was a scheme of pure malice. The only obstacle was convincing me to actually sign the documents. Valerie, the master manipulator, immediately took charge of the psychological warfare. "Leave the emotional aspect to me," she declared, calculating her approach. "Amara was always terribly desperate for our love. She always wanted to feel important. We will tell her that we have reflected on the past, that we have realized we were too harsh, and that we want to bring her back into the family fold." Valerie planned to orchestrate a tearful, highly dramatic reunion, weaponizing the concept of family forgiveness to completely disarm me. They would frame the massive debt transfer not as a trap, but as an exclusive, monumental family responsibility. They would tell me that signing the papers was my way of proving my loyalty, my ultimate chance to save the family legacy and finally earn their respect. Valerie practiced her fake apologies right there in the study, shedding crocodile tears and rehearsing the exact inflection she would use to manipulate my trauma. They honestly believed I was weak enough, lonely enough, and pathetic enough to trade my entire financial future for a fake manufactured hug and a seat at a collapsing table. To execute this targeted ambush, they first needed to locate me. Because they were completely broke, they could not afford a corporate investigation firm. Instead, Marcus scraped together a few $100s from a depleted checking account and hired a cheap private investigator who operated out of a strip mall. He handed the investigator my outdated contact information, an old photograph from college, and a mandate to track down a computer programmer. They sent this amateur sleuth into the bustling metropolis of Atlanta, entirely unaware that the woman they were hunting had evolved into a financial titan. They were looking for a helpless victim to bleed dry, completely oblivious to the reality that I had spent the last 5 years building an empire explicitly designed to consume people like them. As their cheap investigator began searching public records and knocking on doors at rundown apartment complexes, I was sitting in my glass-walled boardroom, directing millions of dollars in asset acquisitions and monitoring the precise trajectory of their bankruptcy. They thought they were the cunning predators, setting a brilliant, deceptive trap for a naive, desperate prey. They had no idea they were blindly marching straight into the jaws of a leviathan. Their pathetic attempt to hunt me down was the exact catalyst I had been patiently waiting for, the final, fatal mistake that would bring them right to my doorstep and initiate their total destruction. The collision happened exactly 3 weeks later at a highly exclusive corporate liquidation auction held in the grand ballroom of a luxury downtown hotel. This was not an event for casual investors. This was a brutal financial battleground where the city's most ruthless corporate vultures gathered to feast on the remains of bankrupt commercial enterprises. Access required proving you held at least $10 million in liquid capital. I sat comfortably in the elevated tier of the VVIP section, completely untouchable. I wore a custom-tailored Tom Ford suit in midnight blue, projecting an aura of absolute dominance and alpha female energy. 2 members of my private security detail stood silently behind my velvet booth, ensuring nobody approached my table without explicit permission. I held a platinum bidding paddle, casually reviewing a digital portfolio of distressed commercial real estate packages I planned to acquire before noon. Down on the main floor, navigating the crowded room of aggressive hedge fund managers and real estate tycoons, were my mother and my sister. Valerie and Kendra had managed to secure entry by leveraging an old favor from a disgraced broker, desperately hoping to network their way into a miraculous financial bailout. They were a pathetic sight, completely out of their depth. They were draped in heavily branded last-season designer clothing, clinging to their oversized luxury handbags like life rafts. Their forced, overly enthusiastic smiles looked brittle and strained. They darted from one group of wealthy investors to another, offering hollow compliments and vaguely pitching Bradley's toxic shell companies as exciting new investments. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that everyone in this room already knew about their catastrophic Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The elite financial community of Atlanta is a small, vicious circle, and my family was the favorite cautionary tale. I watched them from directly above, sipping espresso. They were practically begging, their desperation radiating off them in waves. Valerie cornered a prominent commercial developer, laughing too loudly at a joke he did not make, while Kendra nodded eagerly. The developer politely excused himself after less than 2 minutes, leaving my mother and sister standing awkwardly by a catering station. It was a humiliating display of social freefall. They were no longer the undisputed queens of Buckhead society. They were a nuisance, a liability that serious money actively avoided. I observed their frantic scrambling with clinical detachment. There was no pity in my heart, only a cold, calculated anticipation. I knew the exact moment Kendra's eyes would inevitably wander upward toward the exclusive VVIP balcony. It happened just as the auctioneer announced the opening lot. Kendra, frustrated by another rejected networking attempt, scanned the room desperately, looking for anyone vulnerable enough to listen to her pitch. Her gaze swept over the crowd, moved up the velvet-draped staircase, and locked directly onto my face. From 100 feet away, I saw her entire body jerk in shock. She blinked rapidly, squinting against the harsh ballroom lighting, refusing to believe her own eyes. I did not look away. I held her gaze with terrifying, unblinking stillness, letting the reality of my presence slowly penetrate her delusional worldview. Kendra grabbed Valerie by the elbow, her perfectly manicured nails digging into our mother's silk sleeve. She frantically pointed a trembling finger up at my booth. Valerie turned her head, irritated by the sudden aggressive gesture, and followed the trajectory of Kendra's pointing finger. When my mother finally saw me sitting in the seat of power, the color instantly drained from her heavily contoured face. Her jaw dropped slightly, her carefully maintained posture crumbling in real time. They stood frozen in the middle of the busy auction floor, completely paralyzed by the impossible sight of the daughter they had discarded and declared worthless. I could see the frantic mental gymnastics happening in their heads. Their fragile egos simply could not process the visual evidence of my immense success. In their twisted narcissistic reality, I was a destitute failure who should be begging for their forgiveness. Seeing me flanked by professional bodyguards wearing a suit that cost more than their current checking account balance shattered their internal narrative. Instead of accepting the obvious truth that I had independently built a massive corporate empire, their minds immediately jumped to the most degrading, insulting conclusions possible. I watched Kendra whisper aggressively to Valerie, her face twisting into a sneer of jealous contempt. It was incredibly easy to read her lips from my elevated vantage point. She was assuring our mother that I did not belong there. Kendra was aggressively convincing Valerie that I must have sneaked past the security checkpoints using fake credentials. When that narrative felt too fragile, Kendra pivoted to an even more insulting assumption. She loudly concluded that I was simply a +1, a desperate sugar baby, hanging onto the arm of some wealthy executive who had stepped away for a moment. In her mind, that was the only logical explanation. I could never earn a seat at this table on my own merit, so I must have manipulated my way in through a man. It was the exact same misogynistic, limiting mindset they had used to justify handing $20 million to Bradley. They fundamentally believed that a black woman could only access real power through a male sponsor or sheer deception. Valerie's shock rapidly morphed into self-righteous fury. She straightened her posture, eyes narrowing into slits of pure maternal hatred. She believed my presence was an attempt to embarrass her socially. How dare her estranged daughter infiltrate an elite event and risk exposing their drama? Valerie firmly believed she still held ultimate authority over me. She thought she could march up, demand an explanation, and physically force me to leave. I watched with amusement as my mother squared her shoulders and began marching toward the velvet ropes guarding the VIP staircase, with Kendra trailing right behind her like an eager, vindictive shadow. They were marching toward their own public execution. Valerie approached the velvet rope barrier at the base of the staircase with the furious momentum of a woman who fully expected the world to part for her. She did not pause to consider that the two massive men in dark suits standing guard were not hotel staff, but my personal security contractors. She simply reached out, intending to unhook the brass clasp herself and march up to my table. The lead guard, a former military operative named Marcus, instantly shifted his imposing frame, blocking her path with a solid, unyielding shoulder. Valerie gasped indignantly, stumbling back as her manicured hand hit the solid wall of his tailored chest. She defaulted to her favorite weapon, an overwhelming sense of aristocratic entitlement. She loudly proclaimed her identity, asserting she was the mother of the woman sitting above, demanding the guard step aside so she could discipline her daughter. I sat above the escalating commotion, watching the monitor of my tablet as the first distressed commercial property lot opened for bidding. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, letting the crisp, cold liquid center my focus. Down below, Kendra joined the fray, her voice rising in a desperate, shrill pitch as she threatened to have the security guards fired. They were drawing the attention of several high-profile investors on the main floor. The very people they had been trying so hard to impress were now staring at them with thinly veiled disgust. I tapped the rim of my glass twice, catching Marcus's eye. I gave him a subtle dismissive nod, signaling that he should allow them to ascend the stairs, but under no circumstances were they to cross the threshold into my private booth. Marcus stepped aside just enough to let them pass. Valerie and Kendra practically sprinted up the carpeted steps, their designer heels sinking heavily into the plush fabric. They arrived at the edge of my velvet booth, breathing hard, their faces flushed with a toxic mixture of exertion and righteous anger. Marcus and his partner followed immediately behind them, standing close enough to cast long, intimidating shadows. Valerie did not care. She leaned over the velvet rope, her eyes darting around my booth, frantically searching for the wealthy man she completely assumed had brought me here. When she found only me, her confusion rapidly curdled into bitter, aggressive disdain. "What on earth do you think you are doing here, Amara?" Valerie hissed, keeping her voice low to avoid carrying over the balcony, but failing to hide the absolute venom in her tone. "How did you manage to sneak into this event? Did you steal a credential? Did you lie to the organizers? You are going to get us thrown out, and we are in the middle of extremely important business." Kendra sneered, crossing her arms over her chest. She probably begged one of the vendors to let her in through the service elevator. "Look at her mom. She is just sitting here trying to act rich. It is pathetic. You need to leave right now, Amara. You are embarrassing the family name. Having you lurking up here like a desperate groupie is destroying our credibility." I did not raise my voice. I did not shift my posture. I remained comfortably seated, leaning back against the velvet upholstery, letting the cool silence stretch between us. I looked at the dark circles under my mother's eyes, poorly concealed by heavy makeup. I looked at the frayed stitching on the strap of Kendra's handbag. They were drowning in a sea of their own catastrophic debt, yet they still had the incredible audacity to stand in front of me and demand obedience. They had driven their financial lives into a brick wall, yet firmly believed they held the moral high ground. "You are embarrassing yourself," Valerie continued, her voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. "This is an exclusive gathering for elite professionals. You do not belong here. You have never belonged in rooms like this. I demand that you get up, walk quietly down the back stairs, and leave this building before anyone realizes you are related to us. Do it now, or I will make sure you regret it." I picked up my glass of sparkling water and took another slow, deliberate sip. The condensation felt cool against my fingers. I set the glass down exactly on the center of the coaster. I did not offer an explanation about my software company, my massive wealth, or my bidding paddle. They did not deserve my truth. I looked at Marcus, my head of security, giving him a definitive flick of my wrist. Marcus and his partner moved with terrifying efficiency. Before Valerie could utter another threat, Marcus grabbed her firmly by the upper arm. His partner secured Kendra in the exact same manner. The physical contact shocked them so profoundly they froze for a fraction of a second. Then the screaming began. Valerie shrieked, demanding they unhand her, thrashing against Marcus's iron grip. Kendra kicked and wailed, her voice echoing over the balcony and silencing the entire auction floor. Every single billionaire, hedge fund manager, and real estate developer turned to watch the spectacle. "Get your hands off me!" Valerie screamed, her carefully constructed elite facade completely shattered. "Do you know who I am? I am Valerie. You cannot do this to me. Amara, tell them to let me go right now." As the security guards physically dragged them backward toward the staircase, their expensive shoes scraping across the carpet, I stood up. I walked to the edge of the velvet rope, looking down at their struggling faces. I leaned in close, delivering the words with freezing clarity. "I did not sneak in today. I am here to buy the trash your family left behind." The guards hauled them down the stairs and out the double doors of the ballroom, their screams fading into the corridor. The massive room buzzed with sudden vicious gossip. I sat down, preparing to bid. While I remained in that grand ballroom, systematically acquiring commercial real estate packages, my family was fleeing the city of Atlanta in absolute disgrace. The physical humiliation of being dragged out of a high society event by private security had shattered their remaining delusions of grandeur. They were entirely out of options in the city. Every bank had slammed their doors. Every former friend had blocked their numbers. In a state of sheer blind panic, my father Marcus orchestrated a pathetic Hail Mary pass. He ordered everyone into his least luxury SUV and pointed the vehicle toward the coast of South Carolina. The drive from downtown Atlanta to Hilton Head Island takes roughly 4.5 hours. For the four people trapped inside that confined leather interior, it became a claustrophobic eternity of blame, venom, and suffocating terror. Marcus had a desperate objective. He knew a prominent real estate developer who owned a massive vacation compound on the island. This developer was an old country club acquaintance, a man who possessed the kind of liquid capital necessary to issue a private bridge loan. Marcus genuinely believed he could ambush this man at his private beachfront estate, leverage their past social connections, and beg for enough cash to halt the foreclosure on the Buckhead mansion. It was a completely delusional strategy. Elite investors do not hand out millions of dollars to bankrupt acquaintances who show up uninvited on their doorstep. But logic had long since abandoned my family. They were operating on pure, unadulterated fear. The Buckhead estate was the final symbol of their elite African-American status. Losing it meant total social annihilation. The atmosphere inside the heavy SUV was incredibly toxic. The air conditioning blasted, yet the cabin felt impossibly hot, suffocated by the stench of failure and impending poverty. Bradley sat in the passenger seat, his face twisted into an ugly, resentful scowl. The charming, confident white husband who had happily spent $20 million of my stolen inheritance was completely gone. In his place sat a cornered, bitter man looking for a convenient scapegoat. He gripped the door handle, staring out the window at the passing highway before snapping his head back to glare at the back seat. Kendra was huddled in the corner behind him, clutching her designer handbag as if it were a flotation device. Her makeup was severely smudged from crying outside the hotel, and her expensive silk blouse was wrinkled. Bradley did not offer her an ounce of comfort. Instead, he unleashed a barrage of vicious, relentless verbal abuse. He systematically dismantled her ego, tearing into her business acumen with terrifying cruelty. He called her a foolish, vain little girl who had no business pretending to be an entrepreneur. He loudly listed every single marketing mistake she had made, every overpriced celebrity endorsement she had demanded, and every generic product she had insisted on buying. He told her that her stupidity had completely ruined his life and his reputation. Kendra sobbed, trying to defend herself, but her voice was fragile and shaking. She reminded him that he was the one handling the financial ledgers. She screamed that he was the one who had encouraged her to expand too quickly, to lease the expensive downtown office space, and to throw the lavish launch parties. She accused him of hiding the severity of the bankruptcy from her until it was too late. Bradley laughed, a harsh barking sound that filled the vehicle. He told her she was too ignorant to understand a basic spreadsheet, claiming he had to hide the truth because she would have just thrown another tantrum. He brutally reminded her that without her parents' money she was absolutely nothing, and now that the money was gone, she was entirely worthless. My mother Valerie, sitting next to Kendra in the back, tried desperately to intervene. She reached out to stroke the shoulder of Kendra, demanding that Bradley stop raising his voice. Valerie pleaded for family unity, insisting that arguing would not solve their financial crisis. She commanded Bradley to show respect, reminding him that they had sacrificed everything, including their home and their retirement, to support his business ventures. Bradley turned around in his seat and glared at my mother with pure, unmasked contempt. He told Valerie to shut her mouth. He bluntly stated that their obsession with social status and country club gossip had made them the easiest targets in the world. He mocked their desperate need to appear wealthy, telling them they were pathetic for trying to buy their way into elite circles by funding a doomed cosmetic company. Marcus gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He barked at Bradley to show respect to his wife, but his voice lacked its usual booming authority. The patriarch of the family had been completely stripped of his power. He was driving a leased car he could no longer afford, heading toward a desperate ambush, while his son-in-law openly disrespected him and his wife. Marcus begged everyone to remain calm, pleading with them to hold it together just long enough to secure the bridge loan from the developer. He desperately tried to maintain the illusion that they were a united front, a powerful family hitting a temporary roadblock. But the reality was undeniably clear. They were a pack of starving wolves turning on each other. As the highway miles vanished behind them, The landscape shifted from the dense pine forests of Georgia to the flat, marshy coastlines of South Carolina. The salty ocean air began to filter through the vehicle ventilation system. They crossed the bridge onto Hilton Head Island, driving past manicured golf courses and towering palmetto trees. They were entering the playground of the ultra-rich, a place where they used to belong, but were now arriving as desperate beggars. The tension in the car reached a boiling point as they turned onto the private beachfront road. They searched for an address, ignoring the waiting trap. The leased SUV crept along Oceanfront Drive, the most exclusive stretch of real estate on Hilton Head Island. The road was lined with ancient live oaks draped in Spanish moss, casting twisting shadows across the pristine asphalt. Behind towering privacy hedges and wrought iron gates sat mansions worth tens of millions of dollars. This was a sanctuary for old money and international tycoons. Marcus drove slowly, squinting through the windshield, desperately searching the numbers engraved on the stone pillars. He was looking for the estate of his developer acquaintance, completely unaware his GPS was guiding him directly into my domain. The argument inside the vehicle had finally burned itself out, leaving behind a suffocating silence. Bradley gripped the passenger side door handle, his patience entirely depleted. Valerie dabbed at her eyes with a crumpled tissue, trying to salvage her ruined makeup. Kendra stared blankly out the window, her mind fractured by the impending reality of low-income apartments. She watched the sprawling estates roll by, each one a painful reminder of the life she was about to lose. The display of extreme wealth passing outside her window felt like a personal insult, a mocking preview of the elite society she was being violently ejected from. As they rounded a gentle curve near the end of the private peninsula, the dense tree line suddenly opened up, revealing a property that made the neighboring mansions look like mere guest houses. It was a staggering architectural marvel of glass, steel, and pale stone, perfectly positioned to command a panoramic view of the Atlantic Ocean. The multi-million-dollar modern villa was in the final stages of completion. Dozens of landscapers were actively planting mature palm trees and laying down flawless emerald sod. A fleet of luxury contractor vehicles lined the expansive circular driveway. The scale radiated absolute wealth. Kendra pressed her face against the tinted glass window, her eyes widening in pure envy. She was completely captivated by the modern elegance of the property. For a brief second, she forgot her bankruptcy and simply admired the breathtaking display of power. Then her gaze shifted from the cascading infinity pool directly to the imposing electronic security gates. Standing just outside of those heavy iron gates was a small group of professionals. 3 elite architects in tailored suits held unrolled blueprints, pointing toward the newly constructed guest wing. Standing right at the center of the group, issuing calm, authoritative directives, was a woman. She wore a pristine white linen blazer and perfectly tailored trousers. The coastal breeze caught her hair, revealing her profile. Kendra stopped breathing. The air trapped in her lungs turned to ice. She leaned closer to the glass, her hands trembling violently. It was not a hallucination. It was not a mistake. The woman standing at the gates of the most expensive property on the island, commanding a team of elite architects, was me. "Stop the car!" Kendra shrieked, the sudden, piercing sound shattering the tense silence inside the SUV. "Stop the car right now!" Bradley slammed his foot on the brake pedal instinctively. The heavy vehicle lurched forward, tires screeching against the asphalt as it jerked to a violent halt in the middle of the private street. Marcus threw his arm across Valerie to protect her from the sudden impact. Bradley cursed loudly, demanding to know what was wrong with his wife. Kendra did not answer. She fumbled blindly with the door handle, her movements frantic and uncoordinated. She shoved the heavy door open and stumbled out onto the street. The humid ocean breeze immediately hit her, but she felt absolutely nothing. Her entire body was shaking, seized by a catastrophic psychological breakdown. She took 3 stumbling steps toward my property line and completely collapsed. The fragile mental dam she had constructed to protect her golden child ego finally shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She fell to her knees right there on the pristine asphalt of Oceanfront Drive. The reality of her total failure colliding with the visual proof of my supreme success was simply too much for her mind to process. She stared at the massive glass villa, the team of landscapers, and my armed security detail standing watch. Then she slowly turned her head to look back at the leased SUV. Valerie had just scrambled out of the back seat, her face pale with panic, rushing forward to help her favorite daughter up from the ground. Kendra slapped her mother's hands away with a vicious, violent swipe. The action shocked Valerie so deeply, she actually stumbled backward. Kendra looked up at the woman who had spent 30 years inflating her ego and feeding her delusions. The betrayal in Kendra's eyes was absolute. She opened her mouth and let out a raw, agonizing scream that echoed over the crashing waves. "Why does she get everything?" Kendra shrieked, her voice tearing at her throat, pointing a shaking finger directly at me. "You told me she was nothing. You promised me she was a failure. You said she was completely worthless. Why does she have a palace while I have absolutely nothing left?" Valerie froze, utterly paralyzed by the public spectacle. She looked frantically around the exclusive neighborhood, terrified that a wealthy resident might witness her daughter screaming in the street like a madwoman. She tried to shush Kendra, reaching out again to pull her up, whispering desperate pleas about maintaining dignity. But Kendra was far beyond the concept of dignity. She slapped the pavement with her bare hands, sobbing uncontrollably. "You lied to me," Kendra sobbed, rocking back and forth on her knees. "You told me the family money would make me a billionaire. Now look at her. She owns the world and I am a bankrupt joke." I stood 50 feet away at my electronic gates, observing the meltdown with freezing detachment. Marcus and Bradley finally emerged from their leased vehicle, staring in absolute horror. The men who had arrogantly dismissed me were now standing in my shadow, completely speechless. Marcus was the first to shake off the paralyzing shock. The patriarch of the family, a man who had spent his entire adult life dictating the terms of reality to everyone around him, simply refused to accept the visual evidence of his own irrelevance. He adjusted his wrinkled suit jacket, squaring his shoulders as he marched toward my property line. He stepped over Kendra, who was still kneeling on the pavement, without offering a single glance of paternal comfort. His focus was entirely locked on me. He stopped 3 feet away from my wrought iron security gates. He took a deep breath, inflating his chest, and deployed the deep, authoritative tone he had always used to command absolute obedience. Amara, Marcus commanded, his voice projecting across the salty ocean breeze. "Open these gates immediately. We have driven a long way, and your mother is exhausted. We are going to come inside, sit down, like rational adults, and work this out. The family is facing a serious financial crisis, and since you clearly have resources, you need to step up and do your part. Open the gate, Amara. Let your family inside." I stood perfectly still, my hands resting casually in the pockets of my white linen blazer. I did not flinch at the sound of his voice. I did not revert to the obedient, terrified daughter he expected to see. Bradley marched up to stand shoulder to shoulder with Marcus. The unadulterated audacity of my brother-in-law was staggering. This was the exact same man who had physically hurled my coat and handbag out the front door of the Buckhead mansion 5 years ago. This was the man who had called me a pathetic loser and a freeloader. Standing in front of my estate, his memory conveniently erased his past aggression. His face was flushed with a mixture of desperation and entitled arrogance. He gripped the iron bars, shaking them slightly, as if attempting to force his way onto my property by sheer physical intimidation. "Did you not hear your father?" Bradley snapped, his voice sharp and demanding. "Open the gate." "We are completely out of options in Atlanta. The banks have locked our accounts and we have nowhere else to go. You have a massive compound here with a guest wing that is clearly sitting empty. We are your family. You owe us a place to stay. You cannot just stand there showing off your money while your own flesh and blood is facing homelessness. It is completely unnatural. Let us in right now, Amara. We are moving our bags inside to figure out how you will cover the bridge loan to save the Buckhead house." I looked at Bradley's hands gripping the iron bars. I looked at the sweat beading on his forehead. Then I shifted my gaze back to Marcus. They were entirely delusional. They genuinely believed that our shared DNA somehow obligated me to surrender wealth to fix their catastrophic failures. They firmly thought their demands still carried weight in my universe. Valerie managed to pull Kendra up from the asphalt, and the two women stumbled toward the gates to join the men. They formed a pathetic, desperate cluster of ruined elite society, staring where I had built. Amara, please, Valerie begged, her voice trembling as she attempted to weaponize maternal guilt. Your sister is falling apart. We are all falling apart. You have to save us. You are a good daughter. You have always been a good daughter. Just open the gate and let us rest. We can fix all of this if you just share what you have. I remained absolutely silent. I let their demands and their pathetic pleading wash over me like useless static. I did not raise my voice to argue with them. I did not waste my breath explaining how hard I had worked or how viciously they had thrown me away. Explanations were for equals, and the people standing on the street were nothing to me. They were merely distressed liabilities. Marcus grew frustrated by my icy, impenetrable silence. He slapped his hand against the iron gate. I gave you an order, Amara. You will not disrespect me by ignoring my voice. You will open this gate right this second. I slowly pulled my right hand out of my blazer pocket. My fingers curled around a sleek black remote control. The entire family watched my hand with starving, desperate eyes. They held their collective breath. I locked eyes with Marcus, ensuring he was paying very close attention. I pressed the silver button in the center of the remote. A sharp electronic beep echoed through the air, followed immediately by the low mechanical hum of the heavy security motors engaging. The massive wrought iron gates shuddered and began to slowly swing open inward. Bradley let out a loud sigh of relief, his posture relaxing into arrogant victory. I told you she would cave, he muttered to Kendra, reaching down to grab his designer duffel bag from the pavement. Marcus straightened his tie, looking immensely satisfied that his patriarchal authority had seemingly prevailed. Valerie offered a fragile, grateful smile. They all took a confident step forward, fully intending to march onto my immaculate driveway and claim their unearned sanctuary. They did not make it past the property line. As the gates parted, I took one precise, deliberate step forward, planting myself squarely in the center of the opening. My lead security contractor and two of his heavily armed guards immediately stepped up beside me, forming an impenetrable physical wall of muscle and tactical suits. I stood blocking the entire entrance, staring down at my biological family with cold, lethal authority. They were not guests here, and I was no longer the obedient daughter they could bully into submission. My world operated on my strict rules. They froze instantly, their triumphant smiles vanishing as they realized the gates had not opened to let them in. The air grew thick with a sudden, suffocating realization. Bradley's designer duffel bag slipped from his grasp, hitting the asphalt with a pathetic thud. His arrogant smirk completely dissolved, replaced by the pale, wide-eyed stare of a man who suddenly comprehended he had walked blindly into a trap. Marcus tried to mask his shock with outrage. He thrust his chest forward, attempting to project the illusion of dominance against my wall of armed security contractors. I demanded I instruct my men to step aside, citing my supposed obligations to my elders. Valerie clutched her pearl necklace, her breath hitching in her throat. Kendra simply stared at the immaculate landscaping behind me, her mind entirely broken by the sheer scale of my success. They were all frozen on the wrong side of the property line, waiting for me to break. I remained absolutely motionless. I did not blink. I did not offer a single syllable of explanation or comfort. I merely watched them squirm in the uncomfortable silence, letting the reality of their physical and social exclusion crush whatever remained of their elite delusions. Then the rhythmic sound of leather dress shoes clicking against the pristine paving stones broke the tension. From the shadows of the villa's expansive front portico emerged a man moving with precise, predatory grace. He wore a razor-sharp charcoal gray bespoke suit that screamed corporate warfare. He held a thick, heavy stack of legal folders securely under his left arm. This was David Sterling, my lead corporate litigator and the chief legal architect of my financial technology firm. David was a man who specialized in the surgical dismantling of arrogant debtors. He bypassed the team of architects, walked smoothly down the long driveway, and positioned himself directly beside my right shoulder. He did not look at my biological family with any trace of humanity. He looked at them the exact same way he looked at a spreadsheet full of toxic liabilities. Marcus and Bradley visibly flinched as David approached the iron threshold. They instinctively took a half step backward, their bodies reacting to the undeniable aura of legal threat radiating from the man in the suit. Valerie let out a sharp, breathless gasp. She gripped Marcus by the sleeve, her voice trembling as she frantically whispered her assumptions. She loudly declared that I was attempting to serve them with a restraining order. She accused me of being dramatic and vindictive, insisting that legal separation was entirely unnecessary for a simple family disagreement. Bradley quickly latched onto this narrative, puffing his chest back out. He aggressively told David that a trespassing warning would not hold up in court because they had been explicitly invited to the island by a prominent developer. They were desperately trying to reframe the narrative, attempting to convince themselves that I was simply a bitter, frightened woman trying to keep them physically away from my new wealth. They were completely wrong. David did not hand them a restraining order. He did not hand them a cease and desist letter. He stepped right up to the invisible boundary line separating my sanctuary from the public street. With a swift, practiced motion, he extended his hands and thrust two massive, heavily bound legal dossiers directly into the chests of Marcus and Bradley. The sheer physical weight of the documents caught them off guard. Marcus fumbled, almost dropping the thick binder before gripping it with both hands. Bradley stared down at the glossy black cover, his eyes darting frantically across the gold-embossed lettering of my corporate holding company. The silence returned heavier and infinitely more dangerous than before. Marcus slowly flipped open the heavy cover of the dossier. He stared at the first page. I watched the exact second his brain processed the stark capitalized legal typography printed across the top of the crisp white paper. It was a formal notice of default and intent to foreclose. Marcus stopped breathing. The color violently drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His hands began to shake so severely the thick stack of papers audibly rustled in the quiet coastal air. Bradley ripped his own folder open, his eyes scanning the terrifying paragraphs of financial legalese. He let out a low, strangled gasp, stumbling backward as if the document had physically burned his hands. "You are holding the comprehensive summary of your entire financial existence," I stated, my voice echoing with freezing absolute authority. 5 years ago, I told you I was going to build a machine that purchased the failures of the incompetent elite. My financial technology firm specializes exclusively in the aggressive acquisition and restructuring of distressed assets. When Kendra drove her fraudulent skincare vanity project into the ground, and you foolishly co-signed those massive corporate loans to protect your fragile country club reputation, you created a highly lucrative opportunity for my algorithms. You thought you could simply declare Chapter 11 bankruptcy, hide behind a few sleazy lawyers, and eventually rebuild your superficial lives. You failed to realize that your primary banking institutions were absolutely desperate to offload your toxic, unrecoverable liabilities. They wanted your garbage off their balance sheets. So I bought it. I purchased every single cent of your outstanding commercial and residential debt for pennies on the dollar. I am now your sole legal creditor. You owe me everything. The devastating reality of my absolute power finally crashed down upon them. Valerie collapsed onto her knees beside Kendra, sobbing hysterically into the hot pavement. Bradley dropped his thick legal dossier, hyperventilating as his pathetic arrogance completely evaporated. Marcus stared at me with hollow, defeated eyes, realizing he was entirely at my mercy. He opened his mouth to beg for forgiveness, but absolutely no sound came out. I did not offer them salvation or pity. I pressed my remote and the heavy iron gate slowly began to close, sealing my pristine fortress. I delivered my final verdict. I will see you in the boardroom on Monday morning. The heavy iron gates of my Hilton Head estate clanged shut, sealing my enemies outside. I walked up the limestone driveway. They spent the weekend desperately scrambling for a lifeline, burning through their social capital. By Sunday evening, my corporate legal team received a formal summons. Marcus and Valerie had orchestrated a pathetic ambush. They weaponized their last remaining shred of leverage and called an emergency family intervention. They scheduled the meeting for 10 o'clock Monday morning at a high-end law office in downtown Atlanta. They specifically chose a prestigious firm where my father used to play golf, hoping the intimidating mahogany walls would psychologically break me. I arrived at the downtown skyscraper at exactly 9:55. I did not bring my massive security detail. I only brought two things. I carried my encrypted laptop and I brought Elias. Elias was the most ruthless lead forensic accountant in my entire financial technology firm. He possessed zero emotional intelligence and zero tolerance for corporate fraud. He walked beside me in a crisp charcoal suit, clutching a secure digital drive containing the absolute destruction of my family's remaining dignity. We stepped out of the elevator and approached the conference room at precisely 10 o'clock. Through the partition I observed the trap they had set. Marcus and Valerie sat at the center of the massive oak table flanked by Kendra and Bradley. They had summoned the elders of our extended family to act as a moral firing squad. Aunt Beatrice, a prominent Atlanta judge, sat with her arms crossed. Beside her was Uncle Charles, a wealthy surgeon. Several other cousins filled the leather chairs. My parents had assembled a tribunal of high society African-American elites, fully intending to use peer pressure, immense family guilt, and toxic loyalty to force me into forgiving their catastrophic debt. I pushed the door open and walked into the room. The ambient chatter instantly died. Every pair of judgmental eyes locked onto me. The extended family looked at my custom-tailored suit and my absolute freezing confidence with a mixture of confusion and hidden resentment. They had been briefed on a fabricated narrative over the weekend. Marcus and Valerie spun a tragic tale about a bitter, estranged daughter who stumbled into money and was now ruthlessly trying to evict her own loving parents out of pure spite. They expected me to walk into this tribunal feeling small, intimidated, and desperate to regain the approval of these wealthy relatives. "Please sit down," Amara Uncle Charles commanded, using his deep voice to establish immediate dominance in the room. He pointed to a solitary chair positioned at the far end of the long table, deliberately isolating me from the rest of the group. "We have gathered everyone here today because this situation has escalated far beyond acceptable family behavior. Your parents are deeply distressed. What you are doing to them is completely unconscionable." I did not sit down. I remained standing at the head of the table. Elias stepped forward silently and placed my laptop on the polished oak surface. He began connecting the cables to the central projection system without making eye contact with anyone in the room. "I am not here to have a family therapy session," Charles Weiss stated, my voice echoing off the expensive wood paneling. "I am here to execute a commercial debt restructuring meeting. I am the sole legal creditor for every single financial liability sitting at this table. You are looking at a hostile corporate takeover, not a Thanksgiving dinner argument." Aunt Beatrice slammed her hand against the table, her judicial authority flaring. "You will watch your tone, young lady. You do not speak to your elders with aggressive disrespect. Your mother has been crying for 3 days straight. She is heartbroken. You bought the mortgage to the family home just to hold it hostage. You are trying to destroy the family name over petty childhood grievances. You need to sign the debt forgiveness paperwork today, transfer the deed back to your father, and apologize for this terrible stunt. We will not allow you to tear this family apart." Valerie produced a handkerchief and dabbed at her dry eyes, putting on a masterful performance of maternal suffering for her audience. "We just want our daughter back," she whimpered, looking around the room to garner sympathy. "We know we made some mistakes 5 years ago, but we love you, Amara. We are begging you to do the right thing and save the family legacy. We know you bought that debt because you care about us. Please just sign the release forms and let us heal together." Bradley shifted in his chair, emboldened by the presence of the extended family. He leaned forward and pointed a finger in my direction. "If you do not sign that debt release right now, we are filing a lawsuit against your company," Bradley growled. "We are going to sue you for predatory lending, financial harassment, and a hostile corporate takeover. We will drag your name through the mud and destroy whatever shady little business you have built. You are completely cornered, Amara. The entire family sees exactly what you are doing." I let his empty threats hang in the air. The aunts and uncles nodded along, murmuring their agreement, fully expecting me to crumble under the weight of their disappointment. I looked at their entitled faces. They firmly believed that blood obligated me to absorb their failures. They thought moral grandstanding would magically erase a $20 million deficit. I reached down and opened my silver laptop. The projector screen on the wall behind me flickered to life, bathing the mahogany room in a bright white light. I did not argue with their legal threats. I did not defend my character against their accusations. I simply turned to Elias and gave him a definitive nod. The time for talking was over. It was time to show them the monster hiding inside their house. The blinding white light of the projector screen illuminated the tense faces of my extended family, casting stark shadows against the mahogany walls. The visual warning did not silence them. Instead, it triggered a desperate level of theatrical manipulation. Valerie, recognizing my silence was an impenetrable fortress, doubled down on her maternal performance. She stood up from her leather chair, her hands clasped tightly over her chest, taking 2 trembling steps toward me. She weaponized her tears to paint me as a deeply confused, emotionally fragile child who simply did not understand her own actions. "Amara, please look at me." Valerie pleaded, her voice cracking with an expertly manufactured sorrow. "You do not have to put on this aggressive corporate facade for us. We are your family. We know you bought this debt because you could not bear to see your parents lose their home. You stepped in because you wanted to be our savior. I know you carried a lot of hurt in your heart for 5 years, but using these aggressive financial tactics to force a reconciliation is tearing us apart. You are a good daughter. Just turn off that machine, sit down beside me, and let us forgive each other. We can draft a contract right now to transfer the debt back to the family trust, and we can move forward in love." Uncle Charles nodded solemnly from the sidelines, completely buying into the narrative. Aunt Beatrice dabbed her eyes, whispering about the enduring strength of a mother's love. They looked at me with expectant, patronizing expressions, waiting for my hardened exterior to melt into a puddle of grateful tears. They firmly believed that beneath my tailored suit, I was still the insecure girl begging for a seat at their table. When I remained absolutely motionless, staring at Valerie with eyes like black ice, the maternal illusion began to fracture. My lack of emotional response terrified her. She stopped walking toward me, sensing the lethal predatory energy radiating from my side of the room. The silence stretched uncomfortable and heavy until Bradley violently shattered it. Bradley slammed his open palm against the heavy oak table, the sharp percussive sound making Kendra jump. He realized that Valerie's emotional manipulation was failing miserably, so he aggressively pivoted to the only tactic he thought he understood. He attempted corporate intimidation. He stood up, puffing his chest, trying to project the authority of a seasoned business executive, completely ignoring the fact that he had just bankrupted a $20 million enterprise. "You think this is a game?" Amara Bradley snarled, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You think you can just waltz in here with some cheap accountant and hold us hostage? I know exactly what you are doing. This is the textbook definition of a hostile takeover, and it is completely illegal. Your little financial technology firm used predatory lending algorithms to specifically target our vulnerable assets. You operated with malicious intent to corner our debt while we were in a period of temporary corporate restructuring. I will contact the Securities and Exchange Commission tomorrow morning. I will drag your company through federal court for aggressive bad faith debt collection practices. If you do not disconnect that computer right now and sign a full release of all our corporate and personal liabilities, I swear to God, I will have you disbarred from the financial sector. I will make sure your company is completely dismantled." Kendra chimed in, clinging to Bradley's arm, to present the image of a unified, victimized couple. "She is doing this because she is incredibly jealous." Kendra whined, her voice echoing off the high ceiling. "She has always been jealous of my business and my marriage. She could never build a luxury brand, so she resorted to shady, bottom-feeding debt collection to try and steal what we built. You need to stop this right now, Amara. You are embarrassing the entire family in front of Aunt Beatrice and Uncle Charles. It is pathetic." The aunts and uncles shifted their faces, hardening with collective disapproval. Uncle Charles leaned forward, his surgical precision translating into stern judgment. "Amara, your brother-in-law makes a valid point. Using your wealth to terrorize your own blood is a disgrace to the legacy of Black excellence your grandfather established. We do not use predatory corporate tactics to execute personal vendettas. You are legally and morally out of bounds. I highly suggest you listen to your mother, pack up your equipment, and drop these ridiculous financial claims before you permanently destroy your relationship with this family." I let them exhaust themselves. I stood perfectly still at the head of the conference table, my posture relaxed, my breathing steady. I did not interrupt Bradley's pathetic, legally illiterate rant. I did not correct Kendra's delusional vanity or defend my moral character to Uncle Charles. I simply allowed the oxygen in the room to fuel their raging fire of arrogance. I watched them dig their own graves, shoveling dirt over their heads with every single threat and every single fake tear. Elias stood beside me like a stone gargoyle holding the projector remote. He did not blink. He only spoke the language of raw data, and he knew exactly what was about to happen. Their shouting eventually began to lose its momentum. Bradley ran out of corporate buzzwords. Valerie ran out of fake tears. Kendra ran out of insults. The extended family ran out of moral platitudes. Their voices slowly tapered off into a breathless, heavy silence. They stared at me, panting slightly from their exertions, waiting for my inevitable surrender. They firmly expected me to be terrified by the threat of federal lawsuits. Instead of arguing back, I reached out and gently placed my hand over the keyboard of my laptop. I looked directly into Bradley's arrogant, panicked eyes and pressed the enter key. The massive screen behind me flooded with stark, undeniable reality. A meticulously structured forensic accounting report materialized its bold red and black graphs, cutting through the tension in the room like a scalpel. I stepped aside, allowing the unshakable truth to dominate their field of vision. The extended family, expecting to see a simple mortgage document or a petty list of grievances, squinted at the complex financial flowcharts. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the clinical detachment of a surgeon delivering a terminal diagnosis. "You have all spent the last 5 years worshipping a myth," I stated, walking slowly alongside the projected data. "You believed the narrative that Kendra and Bradley fell victim to a tough market, aggressive competitors, and unfortunate economic timing. You wept for their failed organic skincare empire. You remortgaged your own futures to save them from a tragic business collapse. But the data does not care about your feelings, and the data does not lie. The business did not fail. It was systematically assassinated." I gestured to the first pie chart on the screen. Out of the original $20 million stolen from my grandfather's trust, exactly $8 million went into the actual company. That $8 million funded the luxurious downtown office space, the overpriced celebrity launch parties, the useless marketing campaigns, and the exorbitant executive salaries Kendra and Bradley paid themselves. It was an astonishing display of financial incompetence, but it was not enough to trigger a catastrophic Chapter 11 bankruptcy on its own. The real hemorrhaging happened completely off the books. I pressed the space bar. The slide transitioned to a massive, intricate web of wire transfers. Red lines zigzagged across the screen, connecting the skincare company's main operating account to dozens of obscure entities. "This," I said, locking eyes with Bradley, whose face had suddenly drained of all color, "is a forensic breakdown of the missing $12 million. Kendra leaned forward, her brow furrowed in genuine confusion. She looked from the screen to her husband, her fragile reality beginning to splinter. "Bradley, what is she talking about? Where did that money go?" Bradley swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing erratically. He opened his mouth, but only a dry, choking sound emerged. He shot a desperate, terrifying look at the doorway, calculating the physical distance between his chair and his escape. "Let me explain it to her, Bradley," I offered coldly. I clicked to the next slide, which zoomed in on 3 specific corporate entities located in the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands. Between the second and fourth quarters of your second year in business, Bradley initiated 47 separate wire transfers under the guise of international supply chain logistics and foreign marketing expenditures. However, those vendors did not exist. How was funneling capital directly into offshore limited liability companies? The room erupted into shocked whispers. Uncle Charles adjusted his glasses, leaning close to the projection, his medical mind easily comprehending the surgical nature of the financial dissection. Aunt Beatrice covered her mouth with both hands, the judicial horror dawning on her face. Valerie sat completely paralyzed, her eyes darting frantically between the undeniable banking records and her precious son-in-law. I secured the incorporation documents for these offshore entities. I continued, my voice slicing through the rising murmurs. They are solely owned and operated by one individual, Bradley. He completely bypassed Kendra establishing a secret, untraceable financial bunker while simultaneously bleeding her company dry. He orchestrated the bankruptcy. He starved the business of operating capital, forced the default on the corporate loans, and deliberately triggered the collapse, all while hoarding $12 million in untaxed stolen liquid assets. Kendra let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. She grabbed Bradley by the arm, digging her nails into his expensive suit jacket. "Tell me she is lying," Kendra demanded, her voice breaking into a hysterical pitch. "Tell me you did not steal my money. Tell me you did not ruin my business on purpose." Bradley violently shoved her hand away, his facade completely shattering. "Shut up, Kendra," he snarled, a feral, cornered panic replacing his usual smug demeanor. "It is fake. She fabricated these documents to frame me. It is a complete setup. Do not look at that screen." "Oh, I have much more than bank statements to show the class," I said, clicking the remote one final time. The financial charts vanished. In their place appeared a blown-up image of an email draft. It was time-stamped 2 weeks ago. The recipient line was blank, but the attachment was clearly visible. It was a PDF document titled Petition for Dissolution of Marriage. "My security team gained access to your private encrypted servers during the asset acquisition phase." I explained, relishing the absolute destruction in Bradley's eyes. "We found this sitting in your drafts folder." Bradley retained a cutthroat divorce attorney in Miami 3 months ago. He drafted this email to his legal counsel detailing his exact exit strategy. I read the highlighted text aloud, so no one in the room could ignore the lethal reality. "We wait until the Buckhead mansion is officially seized by the bank. Once my in-laws are completely bankrupted and homeless, they will have zero resources to fund a legal battle against me. Kendra will be drowning in secondary debt. I will file the papers the day the eviction notice hits the front door, fly to the islands, and sever all contact." The silence that followed was apocalyptic. The devastating weight of Bradley's betrayal crushed the breath out of everyone at the table. He had not just stolen their money, he had meticulously plotted their absolute ruin. He planned to ride their financial burning ship all the way down to the ocean floor, only to deploy his golden parachute at the very last second, leaving Kendra and her parents to drown in the wreckage. The golden child stared at the con artist. "Her perfect life was officially permanently destroyed," Kendra snapped. "The fragile illusion of her perfect life, her perfect husband, and her brilliant business acumen evaporated in a single violently destructive instant." She let out a guttural, terrifying scream that tore through the mahogany boardroom. She lunged across the leather chairs, throwing her entire body weight at Bradley. Her manicured hands turned into claws, raking across his face and tearing at the collar of his expensive suit. Bradley shouted in alarm, raising his arms to shield his face as Kendra pummeled his chest with her fists. She was shrieking incoherently, demanding her money back, cursing his name and crying hysterically. The extended family erupted into sheer panic. Marcus rushed forward, grabbing Kendra by the waist and pulling her backward. Kendra thrashed wildly in her father's grip, kicking at Bradley, who scrambled away, his lip bleeding and his designer tie ripped to shreds. I stood motionless beside Elias, observing the pathetic brawl with absolute detachment. Now they were literally tearing each other apart like cornered animals. I did not intervene. I let the raw, ugly reality of their dynamic fully expose itself to the aunts and uncles who had just lectured me on family loyalty. Once Marcus managed to drag a sobbing, hyperventilating Kendra back into her seat, the boardroom fell into a heavy, traumatic silence. The only sound was Kendra catching her breath and Bradley straightening his ruined suit, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit. I tapped the keyboard. The projector screen shifted abruptly. The offshore bank accounts and divorce drafts vanished, replaced by a high-resolution scan of a single yellowed piece of paper. "I am not finished," I announced, my voice cutting through the heavy breathing and muffled sobs. "Bradley is a parasite who bled this family dry, but he is merely a symptom of a much larger disease. He could never have executed his embezzlement if he had not been handed the keys to the vault by someone who thought they were above the law." I looked directly at my father. Marcus froze, his hands still resting on Kendra's shoulders. The color completely drained from his face for the second time that morning, leaving him looking hollow, incredibly old, and utterly terrified. "This is the original withdrawal authorization slip from 5 years ago," I explained, pacing slowly along the edge of the conference table. This is the exact piece of paper that authorized the transfer of $20 million from my grandfather's irrevocable trust account into the hands of a con artist. As I reminded everyone 5 years ago, that specific trust required 2 signatures for any transaction exceeding $50,000. It required the signature of the primary trustee, Marcus, and the signature of the secondary beneficiary, me. I pressed the spacebar. The slide animated, zooming in on the bottom right corner of the withdrawal slip. 2 signatures sat side by side on the ink lines. One belonged to my father, the other clearly spelled out my name. I never signed this document, I stated, the freezing temperature of my voice dropping another 10 degrees. I was never in the room when this transfer was initiated. I never gave my legal consent, yet my signature miraculously appeared on the bank authorization. Aunt Beatrice leaned forward, her judicial instincts overriding her family loyalty. Amara, are you making a formal accusation of forgery against your own father? I am not making an accusation, Beatrice, I corrected her smoothly. I am presenting a forensic certainty. I clicked the remote. A new slide appeared side by side with the withdrawal slip. It was a comprehensive 90-page report from a federally certified forensic document examiner. The screen displayed a microscopic pixel-by-pixel breakdown of the signature on the bank slip compared to a dozen verified samples of my actual handwriting. Red circles and arrows highlighted discrepancies in pen pressure, loop formation, and stroke velocity. I hired a former federal handwriting analyst to review the original bank records. I continued, my eyes locked onto Marcus. The forensic report is conclusive. The signature on the authorization form is a calculated criminal forgery. My father did not just bypass me. He sat in a bank office, picked up a pen, and committed identity theft to steal $20 million of generational wealth. Marcus stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of his leather chair. He dropped into the seat, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. Valerie stared at him in sheer absolute horror, realizing the catastrophic legal boundary her husband had crossed. Forging a signature to authorize the unauthorized transfer of funds across state banking lines is not a minor family dispute, I declared, raising my voice to command the entire room. Under Title 18 United States Code Section 1343, this constitutes federal wire fraud. Furthermore, because it involved a federally insured financial institution, it triggers bank fraud statutes. The statute of limitations for these specific federal crimes is 10 years. We are only at year 5. The extended family gasped in absolute terror. The elite facade was entirely and completely obliterated. Uncle Charles sank back into his chair, rubbing his temples in disbelief. Aunt Beatrice stared at Marcus with a mixture of disgust and professional panic, instantly calculating the devastating legal fallout that would taint the entire family name. They had come to this meeting prepared to scold a disrespectful daughter. They were now witnessing the unearthing of a massive federal crime committed by their esteemed patriarch. You lied to the bank, you lied to the trustees, and you lied to yourselves, I said, staring down at the broken man who had once thrown me away. You risked a federal prison sentence of up to 30 years just to maintain your fragile country club reputation. You sacrificed your own brilliant daughter to fund a manipulative fraudster because you were simply too arrogant to admit you made a bad investment. You are just a pathetic common criminal in a tailored suit. The crushing weight of that truth shattered the room. Absolute pandemonium erupted inside the previously dignified legal office. Aunt Beatrice stood up so fast her leather chair crashed backward into the mahogany credenza. She immediately distanced herself from Marcus, her judicial instincts screaming at her to physically separate from a confessed felon. Uncle Charles grabbed his briefcase, muttering prayers of disbelief, as he realized the family name was about to be dragged through the federal court system. They had arrived expecting to scold a disobedient child. Instead, they were standing at ground zero of an active crime scene. The moral superiority they had wielded just 10 minutes ago evaporated into thin air, replaced by sheer, unadulterated panic. They looked at Marcus not as a respected patriarch, but as a toxic liability who had infected their pristine lineage. Marcus remained glued to his seat, completely paralyzed. His hands trembled violently in his lap. The suffocating realization of his actions crashed down upon him, crushing the breath from his lungs. He had sacrificed his brilliant, fiercely loyal daughter to appease his own shallow vanity. He had committed a federal crime, jeopardized his freedom, and destroyed his entire legacy. And for what? For a white con artist who secretly despised them. Valerie sat frozen beside him, her perfectly painted lips parted in a silent scream. She looked at Amara, the child she had labeled worthless, and finally understood the magnitude of her maternal failure. The daughter she threw away was an untouchable titan. The daughter she kept was a bankrupt, manipulated pawn. Valerie's elite country club life was officially over. There would be no more galas, no charity boards, only mugshots and criminal indictments. In the corner of the room, the golden marriage met a spectacularly brutal end. Bradley, realizing his meticulously crafted exit strategy had been intercepted and destroyed, dropped his charming facade entirely. The suave, sophisticated businessman vanished, revealing the desperate, cornered rat underneath. He backed away from Kendra, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavy double doors. Kendra reached out for him, her voice cracking as she begged him to deny the offshore accounts, to tell her they could still fix this. She clung to the last shred of her delusional reality. Bradley swatted her hands away with vicious force, his face twisting into a mask of pure disgust. "Get your hands off me!" Bradley yelled, his voice cracking with hysterical panic. "I am not going down for your incompetent family. You are all pathetic. You paraded me around your little country club events pretending you were old money while your father literally forged checks to keep the lights on. I took that money because you were too stupid to manage it. You handed me the keys to the vault because you were desperate to have a white savior validate your fragile social status. I am not spending a single day in a federal penitentiary to protect your miserable vanity brand. I am leaving right now, and I am taking every cent I secured." Kendra collapsed onto the floor, weeping uncontrollably as the absolute humiliation of his words washed over the extended family. She had based her entire identity on being superior to me, on having the perfect husband and the perfect business. Now she was kneeling on a conference room rug, publicly degraded by the man who had stolen her life. Her mother could not even reach out to comfort her, too paralyzed by the impending threat of federal prison. The perfect Buckhead family was officially a smoking crater of lies, theft, and shattered egos. Bradley did not wait for anyone to respond to his vicious outburst. He turned his back on his sobbing wife and lunged toward the exit. He grabbed his leather briefcase from the side table, his knuckles white with desperation. He shoved his way past Uncle Charles, nearly knocking the older physician to the floor. He believed he still had a window of opportunity. In his panicked mind, he thought he could sprint out of the building, hail a taxi to the international terminal, and catch a flight to the Cayman Islands before my financial technology firm could legally freeze his offshore accounts. He operated under the delusion that he was always one step ahead. I did not move to intercept him. I did not order Elias to block the door. I simply stood at the head of the conference table, watching Bradley scramble like a terrified insect. Aunt Beatrice shouted for someone to stop him, her voice echoing in the chaotic room, but nobody intervened. They were all too stunned by the rapid collapse of their reality to physically restrain a desperate man. Bradley reached the heavy mahogany double doors. He grabbed the brass handles, his shoulders heaving with adrenaline. He threw his weight backward, fully intending to rip the doors open and sprint down the carpeted hallway toward the elevators and his ultimate freedom. He yanked the handles, but the doors did not budge. I smiled, a predatory expression that chilled the air in the room. I slowly raised my left arm, pulling back the cuff of my custom-tailored jacket. I glanced down at my diamond-encrusted luxury watch. The second hand ticked precisely past the 12. It was exactly 10:30 in the morning. The timing was absolutely flawless. I looked up from my wrist and locked eyes with Bradley across the room. His face was pressed against the mahogany wood, a look of utter confusion replacing his frantic desperation. "Why are the doors locked?" Bradley demanded, rattling the brass handles. "Open this door right now. You cannot hold me here. This is false imprisonment. Open the door." He threw his shoulder against the wood, a pathetic display of physical weakness. He was hyperventilating the reality of his trapped status, finally breaching his arrogant mind. I watched him slowly realize his absolute destruction was finally arriving today. The perfect corporate trap had just snapped shut around him, sealing his fate completely. Bradley yanked the brass handles a third time, his polished dress shoes slipping against the expensive carpet. His frantic breathing echoed in the silent room. He turned around his chest, heaving his eyes wide with the realization that he was entirely caged. The extended family remained frozen in their seats, too stunned by the cascading revelations to process his attempted flight. Then a heavy rhythmic pounding sounded from the corridor. It was not the polite knock of a legal assistant, it was the mistakable aggressive thud of law enforcement. Before Bradley could even step away from the wood paneling, the double doors violently swung inward. He was knocked backward, stumbling into a side table and sending a crystal water pitcher shattering to the floor. The entrance was instantly flooded with federal agents and local police officers. They wore dark tactical windbreakers with stark yellow lettering, spelling out the initials of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The visual collision of armed federal agents pouring into the meticulously decorated mahogany boardroom shattered the remaining illusion of high society safety. A tall, broad-shouldered lead agent stepped through the threshold, his gaze scanning the room before locking directly onto the man scrambling to find his footing amidst the broken glass. The agent did not care about the expensive suits, the judicial titles of the aunts and uncles, or the elite pedigree of the family sitting at the table. He pulled a folded warrant from his jacket pocket. Bradley the agent barked, his voice carrying absolute non-negotiable authority. "You are going to step away from the door and put your hands behind your back." Bradley raised his hands in a pathetic, trembling gesture of surrender. He tried to summon the slick, charismatic corporate persona that had successfully charmed my parents for 5 years. He attempted to deploy his white privilege, adopting a tone of offended innocence. "Officer, there has been a massive misunderstanding here," Bradley stammered, smoothing his torn tie with shaking fingers. "This is a private family dispute regarding a civil bankruptcy matter. My sister-in-law is simply trying to intimidate us. I am a respected business owner. You have no jurisdiction to interrupt a private legal negotiation." The lead agent did not even blink. He stepped closer, closing the distance with predatory speed. "We have full jurisdiction when $20 million is fraudulently routed through offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands. We received a comprehensive forensic accounting dossier from the Financial Crimes Unit at 6 o'clock this morning. We have the wire transfer receipts, the dummy corporation filings, and your drafted flight itinerary. You are not going anywhere except federal custody." The agent grabbed Bradley by the shoulder and spun him around, slamming him chest first against the polished oak conference table. The impact rattled the coffee cups and sent a shockwave of terror through my mother. 2 officers immediately flanked him, the sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs, ratcheting tightly around Bradley's wrists, sliced through the room. It was the sound of complete, undeniable defeat. Bradley winced in pain as his arms were wrenched awkwardly behind his back. The arrogant swagger was entirely gone. He was no longer the brilliant entrepreneur who was going to elevate the family name. He was just a common thief caught in a trap he was too arrogant to see coming. "You have the right to remain silent." The arresting officer recited, his voice monotone and practiced. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." As the Miranda rights were read aloud, Kendra let out a suffocating broken whimper. She pressed both hands over her mouth, watching the man she loved, the man who had supposedly built an empire for her, being physically restrained like a violent criminal. Bradley did not look at her. He did not look at my parents. His eyes darted wildly around the floor, completely consumed by his own selfish panic. The extended family watched the scene unfold in absolute humiliating silence. Aunt Beatrice, a woman who had spent decades presiding over a courtroom, sat completely paralyzed as federal agents processed an arrest, inches from her face. Uncle Charles stared at the floor, the suffocating reality of the scandal settling heavily upon his shoulders. They had arrived at this office prepared to exert their moral superiority and force me to submit to their demands. Instead, they were front-row spectators to the total annihilation of their family legacy. Marcus and Valerie were practically vibrating with terror. They sat frozen in their leather chairs, watching the golden boy they had favored, funded, and protected being hauled away in steel chains. They had sacrificed their brilliant, fiercely loyal daughter to prop up the illusion of this man. They had committed federal wire fraud to ensure he had the capital to play CEO. Now they were watching their terrible investment yield its final catastrophic return. I stood silently beside Elias, observing the entire spectacle with freezing detachment. I did not smile. I did not gloat. The sheer magnitude of my victory required no theatrical celebration. I had meticulously planned this exact sequence of events. I submitted the forensic data precisely when I knew it would trigger an immediate arrest warrant. I coordinated the timing to ensure the authorities breached those doors at the exact moment Bradley realized he was trapped. The agents pulled Bradley away from the conference table. He stumbled awkwardly, his designer shoes dragging across the expensive carpet. As they marched him toward the exit, he finally lifted his head and locked eyes with me. There was no anger left in his gaze, only a hollow, pathetic realization that he had been completely outplayed by the woman he had discarded. I held his gaze until the agents shoved him through the doorway and out into the corridor. The heavy mahogany doors remained open, leaving my family fully exposed to their undeniable legal and financial doom forever. The echoing footsteps of the federal agents dragging Bradley down the corridor faded into a ringing, suffocating silence inside the boardroom. The extended family did not linger to offer comfort or solidarity. Aunt Beatrice gathered her legal files and practically sprinted toward the exit, eager to distance her pristine judicial reputation from confessed felons. Uncle Charles followed closely behind, avoiding all eye contact with his brother. The cousins and other relatives scattered like roaches, fleeing a sudden bright light. Within 60 seconds, the massive conference room emptied of its elite spectators, leaving only the true architects of this catastrophe. Marcus, Valerie, and Kendra were left completely alone with me and Elias, the cold architects of their ruin. With their audience gone and their golden son-in-law carted off in steel chains, the final psychological barrier, protecting my parents, completely shattered. Marcus, the man who had spent his entire life commanding rooms and demanding absolute respect, crumbled. He literally collapsed. His legs gave out beneath him, and he hit the expensive rug hard, dropping to his knees at the edge of the conference table. A second later, Valerie fell beside him. The flawless matriarch of Buckhead society buried her face in her hands and began to weep with loud, ugly, heaving sobs. All of their elite pride, their country club arrogance, and their suffocating entitlement vanished into the floorboards. They were no longer untouchable socialites. They were desperate, terrified criminals staring down the barrel of a federal indictment. "Amara, please." Marcus begged, his voice unrecognizable, a pathetic, grating whisper. He reached out a trembling hand toward me, though he did not dare cross the physical distance. "I am so sorry. I was desperate. The bank was breathing down my neck, and Bradley promised the business would turn around. I never wanted to hurt you. I was just trying to protect our legacy. Please do not hand those forgery documents over to the federal prosecutor. You have to show mercy. If I go to prison, I will die there. Please, Amara, you are my daughter." Valerie crawled forward on her knees, her designer dress dragging across the carpet. "We will do whatever you want," Valerie wailed, tears streaming down her face, ruining her heavy makeup. "We will sign the house over to you. We will publicly apologize. Just please let us stay in the home. Do not throw us out onto the street. We have nothing left, Amara. Bradley took everything. I beg of you, do not leave your mother homeless. I was wrong about you. You are brilliant. You are the best thing that ever happened to this family. Just show us a little grace." They were groveling. Their apologies were completely hollow, motivated entirely by the immediate threat of incarceration and homelessness. They were not sorry for abusing me. They were only sorry they had been outplayed. Before I could even process their pathetic display, another figure scrambled across the floor. Kendra, who had been paralyzed by the shock of Bradley's arrest, suddenly crawled toward me like a feral, desperate animal. She threw herself at my feet and lunged forward, wrapping her arms tightly around my tailored trousers. She buried her face into my legs, clinging to me with a frantic, hysterical grip. "Amara, you have to help me!" Kendra screamed, her voice raw and jagged. "You have to destroy him. You have all this power and all these lawyers. Make Bradley pay for what he did to me. Make sure he rots in a cell forever. You have to get my $12 million back. He ruined my life, Amara. He humiliated me. You are my big sister. You have to fix this for me, please. The absolute delusion of her request was staggering. After spending her entire life looking down on me, mocking my career, and happily spending the money stolen from my name, Kendra genuinely believed I would now act as her personal attack dog. She thought the bond of sisterhood which she had happily discarded when it suited her would magically compel me to wage a legal war on her behalf, just to soothe her wounded ego. I looked down at the three of them kneeling on the floor, weeping and pleading. They looked exactly like the pathetic, weak people they had always been underneath their designer clothes. They had spent decades building themselves up by tearing me down. Now they were begging the very person they had tried to bury to become their savior. I did not feel a single drop of pity. I did not feel a rush of familial love or an urge to forgive. My heart was completely steady, my breathing perfectly even. I looked at my mother sobbing about being homeless. I looked at my father trembling at the prospect of federal prison. I looked at my sister clinging to my legs, expecting me to fight her battles. I took a deliberate step backward, pulling my pant leg free from Kendra's desperate grasp. She let out a sharp cry, tumbling forward slightly as her support vanished. I stood tall, adjusting the cuff of my blazer. I looked down at them with eyes like ice, my expression devoid of any human warmth. They stared up at me, their tears slowing as they waited for a verdict, hoping their pathetic display had somehow triggered a dormant sense of family loyalty. This is the moment their entire universe ends. There is no salvation coming from me. There is only the cold, hard reality of the choices they made 5 years ago, when they handed my future to a con artist and told me I was nothing. 5 years ago, you told me I was wasting space. I delivered the final lethal line, my voice echoing with authority. Now you are polluting the air in my boardroom. You have 30 days to vacate my property. I turned on my heel and walked out of the mahogany boardroom, leaving my biological family weeping on the floor. I did not look back. Elias followed silently, shutting the heavy double doors behind us with a definitive thud. The 30-day eviction notice was legally enforced precisely on schedule. The foreclosure of the Buckhead estate proceeded without a single hitch, stripping them of their final grand illusion. 6 months later, the dust had completely settled over the ruins of their former lives, leaving behind a stark and unforgiving new reality they could never escape. The sweeping brick driveways and crystal chandeliers of elite Atlanta society were permanently gone. Marcus and Valerie now lived in a cramped two-bedroom apartment in a low-income complex on the miserable outskirts of the city. The thin walls offered no insulation from the constant noise of the street below, a jarring, terrible contrast to the serene, guarded silence they had enjoyed for decades. My father avoided federal prison by pleading guilty to the wire fraud charges, trading his freedom for 5 years of strict probation and a massive restitution order he could never hope to pay. He spent his days sitting in a cheap, worn recliner staring blankly at a small television screen, the booming patriarchal authority entirely drained from his frail, broken body. Valerie, stripped of her designer wardrobe and her expensive country club memberships, was a pathetic ghost of her former self. Her wealthy friends had abandoned her the instant the federal indictments became public knowledge. She was permanently exiled from the elite circles she had worshipped, forced to navigate crowded discount grocery stores while hiding her face beneath a frayed sun hat. The overwhelming shame of their public downfall was a heavy, suffocating blanket they wore every single day. Kendra faced an equally brutal, humiliating awakening. Without her parents' massive wealth to prop up her delusions of grandeur, the former golden child was forced to enter the actual workforce with absolutely zero marketable skills. She secured a minimum-wage retail job at a mid-tier department store, standing on her aching feet for 8 hours a day under harsh fluorescent lights. The bitter irony was incredibly thick. The woman who once demanded $20 million to build a luxury skincare empire now spent her miserable afternoons aggressively pushing generic perfume samples onto annoyed shoppers just to meet her daily sales quota. She wore a cheap polyester uniform and a plastic name tag, routinely enduring the rudeness of entitled customers who treated her exactly the way she used to treat service workers. Every time she swiped her employee discount card to buy basic groceries, she was violently reminded of the massive empire she threw away. Her beloved husband, Bradley, had been sentenced to 10 miserable years in a federal penitentiary for embezzlement and wire fraud, his offshore accounts completely seized and liquidated by my legal firm. Kendra had absolutely no one left to blame for her daily misery but herself, miles away from the depressing reality of the crowded city. The coastal air of South Carolina was crisp, clean, and perfectly calm. I stood confidently on the sprawling limestone balcony of my incredible Hilton Head villa. The warm afternoon sun cast a brilliant golden hue across the crashing white waves of the Atlantic Ocean. The multi-million-dollar estate was fully completed, a breathtaking modern fortress of steel architecture and impenetrable private security. I wore a simple, elegant silk slip dress, my bare feet resting against the warm stone tiles. There was absolutely no chaos here. There were no ringing phones from desperate debt collectors, no frantic screaming matches about bankrupt shell companies, and absolutely no toxic family members demanding a piece of my soul. I had successfully achieved total undisputed financial and emotional freedom. I leaned casually against the thick glass railing, holding a crystal glass of an incredibly rare vintage Bordeaux wine. I took a slow, measured sip, letting the complex dark flavors settle smoothly on my palate. I looked out at the endless horizon, silently watching a distant white sailboat cut through the dark blue water. People often ask if holding on to a deep grudge is mentally exhausting. They naturally assume that executing a hostile corporate takeover against your own flesh and blood would leave you feeling hollow, guilty, or terribly burdened by lingering sadness. They expect a dramatic emotional realization where I suddenly regret my cold ruthlessness. They are entirely and completely wrong. I felt absolutely nothing for the pathetic people struggling in that cramped apartment in Atlanta. I felt no pity for my father's ruined pride, no sorrow for my mother's complete social exile, and certainly no sympathy for my sister's daily retail nightmare. They had willingly made their terrible choices 5 years ago, when they proudly handed a worthless con artist my inheritance and physically threw me out into the dark street. They had confidently dug their own graves, and I simply provided the expensive headstones. I did not just get simple revenge. Revenge is a messy, emotional, chaotic reaction. What I flawlessly executed was a surgical, calculated corporate extraction. I systematically identified a toxic infection that had plagued my entire existence, meticulously isolated it, and ruthlessly cut it out of my life forever. I successfully secured my grand empire, powerfully protected my inner peace, and legally ensured that no one would ever dare view me as a disposable financial asset again. The salty ocean breeze caught my dark hair, carrying the sweet scent of water, an absolute undeniable victory. I proudly raised my crystal wineglass toward the bright horizon, offering a quiet, silent toast to the brilliant, unstoppable alpha woman I had ultimately become. The massive financial empire was securely mine, the outstanding debts were paid in full, and the painful past was finally dead. I took one last satisfied look at the beautiful, boundless ocean before turning my back to the sparkling water and walking inside my pristine, quiet home. The story teaches us about the undeniable power of boundaries, self-worth, and the heavy consequences of toxic entitlement. True success comes from within, not from exploiting others for personal gain. When people underestimate you or treat you poorly, the best response is not immediate anger, but quiet, relentless self-improvement. By bravely walking away from toxic environments and building your own financial independence, you protect your inner peace and create a reality where no one can dictate your value. Family should always be built on mutual respect. Never let anyone convince you that you are worthless just because they cannot see your true potential. Drop a comment below if you have ever had to set strict boundaries to protect your peace, and hit that subscribe button for more stories about reclaiming your worth.